Heilbrunn, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Jacob. I'm really happy to be here again. I really appreciate the invite.
The House of Representatives conducted an important vote yesterday, passing a resolution that would deny Trump the ability to conduct further strikes against Iran. And a number of Republicans also joined the Democrats on this resolution. What is your take on the status of the American war against Iran?
I've been a supporter of taking military action against Iran. Having said that, so I support what President Trump is trying to do in Iran. I think it's a historic opportunity. We should not go wobbly at this moment. It would be a historic achievement if 6 months from today we play this tape back and we look and say there's a change in the nature of the regime of Venezuela, there's a change in the nature of regime of Cuba, and there's a change in the nature of regime of Iran. This would be foreign policy historic change. I think many folks, so having said that, so I'm very supportive of it. It's tricky and complicated and risky, but it's worth the risk. Having said that, since the beginning, the military actions in Iran have been not necessarily as popular with the American broadly in the American public, though I think it remains popular with mainly most Republicans. I'm guessing a small number of Republicans, my understanding was a small number of Republicans joined the Democrats in this vote. So I think you've noticed that President Trump paused after, I think it was like a 60-day period because of sort of the legislative arrangements around you can take military action up to 60 days without seeking some sort of a congressional action of some kind. I think this goes back to the 1970s and the War Powers Act that was to try and constrain presidential action in foreign policy. So and then I think they've come up with some language to say, well, we've ceased hostilities briefly so they could, in essence, restart the clock down the roads. But I do think the fact that you had this vote signals that there are some Republicans getting cold feet, that Democrats are using this to, and I think it's unfortunate because it's the sort of thing where we should be supporting our men and women in harm's way. And so I don't want to say they're necessarily doing this as a political gesture, but it certainly seems as if it's a political gesture. But the fact that they were able to muster those votes speaks to that they are channeling concerns about the situation in the Middle East. So I suspect I'm in the minority, but I believe that President Trump has been right to pursue this course.
Now, a new Fox News poll that was released today indicates that Sherrod Brown, who is the Democratic challenger against Republican John Husted in the state of Ohio, is 8 points ahead. Does that not suggest that the war is taking a toll on Republican political fortunes as the party heads into the midterms?
Well, I think having been to Ohio and also knowing that Sherrod Brown used to represent the great state of Ohio for more than 30 years. I think he was a 4 or 5 term senator from Ohio. So he's very, very high name recognition in Ohio. And President Trump is not on the ballot in the 2026 midterms. And the Republican Senator John Husted, I don't know if it's pronounced Husted or Husted, is not as well known. So I think some of it may be name recognition, but the fact and I'd want to see other polls to see where former Senator Sherrod Brown is. Excuse me. But what I would say is it could be a function of several things. I don't believe one poll. I'd want to see other polls. Some of it may be a function of former Senator Brown's very strong name recognition. Some of it may be a function of the price of gasoline. Some of it may be foreign policy related, though I think most elections in America, so folks like you and me who pay attention to foreign policy issues, it does matter, especially when there's an unpopular war or an unpopular military action. At the same time, I think we should mourn every person who has died in this conflict, but the relative very small number of folks who unfortunately had to give their life for this important cause, I'm not quite sure it's the primary driver of what's happening in Ohio. I would have a hard time believing that, and I would have to look at the polls and say, what are the top 3 issues? And I'm going to bet it's the price of food and fuel, crime, and migration.
Let's talk about...
But could be.
Let's talk about fuel prices, because Exxon has stated that should the war continue in its current status, the price of oil could go to $160 a barrel.
And right now it's about 100 or 90.
Do you think that is politically sustainable?
So I think that is a huge... my strong hope is that it does not happen, of course. And for any president, we shouldn't wish it for the American people, because it's an undue hardship on the American people, especially workers and the poor are the ones that, like working class folks, are the ones that are going to take it on the chin harder than anybody else. It's a regressive tax. So there's discussions about going through the Strategic Petroleum Reserve and other resources, and what happens if...
Though the reserve has been drained substantially.
Has been almost drained, yeah. And I know that, I believe that some of it was drained during President Biden's administration, and there were some calls by Republicans at the time that perhaps this wasn't the moment to drain the reserves. And so I think as a result, we don't have the reserves that we might have had if that hadn't happened. But I think we'll know more. I think if there is a return to hostilities in Iran, there's the possibility that the Iranians hit the Gulf energy production assets. And so the sorts of numbers that the energy executive was talking about is not outside of the realm of possibility. It's possible, but one would hope that that doesn't happen.
Now, Dan, you've been traveling quite a bit.
I've been on the road. I've been on the road a lot.
Tell us about some of your journeys.
So most recently, I was in Colombia. I was an election observer for the first round of the election in Colombia. So there are a number of candidates for president. The 2 finalists are Abelardo de la Espriella, but just for this conversation, we'll call him Abelardo. And then there was the candidate for President Ivan Cepeda. These are the 2 finalists. Abelardo got...
In what capacity were you there as an observer?
I was with the International Republican Institute, which is a nonprofit organization that is not technically associated with the Republican Party, but 40 years ago, there were a network of institutions, Jacob, were set up under the umbrella of the National Endowment for Democracy, mirroring the very successful network of political party institutes in Germany called Stiftungen. Mm-hmm. And so there's a Republican affiliated one that's not officially affiliated with the Republican Party, and there's a National Democratic Institute, which is all, right. And then there's also one that's associated with American Labor called Solidarity Center, and then there's one associated with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce called the Center for International Private Enterprise. But there are 4 institutions under the National Endowment for Democracy. So this was a electoral observation mission supported by the National Endowment for Democracy. There was a senior person from the National Democratic Institute as part of this observation mission. There were about 28 people in total, so it was a privilege to be there. I participated primarily in Bogota. I saw thousands of Colombians exercise their sovereign right to vote. I did not see anybody have their ability to vote obstructed in any way, and I believe that and there were no long lines. There were no disputes at the polling stations I visited. I visited several polling stations in the greater Bogota area. The upshot is, for the first round, Abelardo got about 44% of the vote, and Ivan Cepeda got about 41% of the vote. And then the rest was divided among centrist and center-right smaller candidates. So the question is, in the second round, what will happen to the center-right and centrist voters? There was a very high turnout. It was about 58% of the vote. This was on Sunday, which is historically very high for Colombia. It was very interesting for several reasons. One was, when you vote, Jacob, in Colombia, you get a ticket. And if you want to pay for a passport or a driver's license, you get a 10% discount on the payment. The official processing fee is discounted if you can demonstrate you voted. I thought that was very interesting, and I actually think something like that ought to be instituted in this country. And then the initial count for the entire country of 40 million voters took 2 hours. And then a secondary count that was sort of the official count took 48 hours. Think about, we had primaries in California, and it may take several days or even a week to get a full count. This is Nate Silver, who's not a Republican, would tell you this is like failed state territory. So there's many things they do quite well. They had biometric identity. You had to show a photo ID. Most countries, dozens and dozens of countries, have photo ID across the country. And they even use biometric identification, whether it could be a fingerprint on a digital on a digital screen, or an optical digital ID. That may be a bridge too far for Americans.
Well, let's not forget, Americans have a long libertarian tradition.
Streak, correct. So I think it may...
The Jacksonian, don't tread on me.
Don't tread on me. So I think it may be it may be too Big Brother adjacent for many American citizens of any political stripe. But I will say I was impressed. There was the kind of vote fraud of saying, I'm so-and-so, you can't do that. The other thing I asked the folks is, okay, what happens if I die? How am I removed off the voter rolls? In the United States, elections are administered by counties. There's many countries in the world, there's a national electoral observation body. And then there's a central civil register, which registers things like births, deaths, marriages. It's not done at the county courthouse. I know we have a decentralized system that has many positives about it. But one is that as soon as you die, within a very short order, that information is relayed to the electoral body, so you're taken off the rolls. So the phenomenon of dead people voting, which is well known in the United States, is not a problem in Colombia. So those were several observations I had. I'm of the view that the conservative candidate will likely get the vast majority of the center-right candidates' votes and will likely split the centrist votes. So I believe there's 4 scenarios. On June the 21st, there'll be the conservative candidate wins by 8. The second scenario is the conservative candidate wins by 3 to 5 points. The third scenario is the conservative candidate wins by a squeaker, or the progressive candidate, the very progressive candidate, wins by a squeaker. Those are the 4 scenarios. I'm of the second scenario, which is I believe the conservative candidate will win by between 3 and 5 points.
Now, you also believe that it's time for elections in Venezuela.
I would like to see elections in Venezuela. So I thought the action that President Trump took is an action only President Trump could have taken. It was fantastic earlier this year. I think it put the fear of God into the Chavez regime. We have seen increases in energy production. There's significant interest in investment in Venezuela in energy and potentially in minerals. Most of the mining needs to be regularized in Venezuela. There's enormous energy opportunities. There's other infrastructure and transport opportunities in Venezuela. The best case scenario would be to have elections in Venezuela, ideally in the last part of 2027. We should start thinking about getting ready for that. I want to believe that there's certainly many voices in Congress, including Chair Maria Salazar, the chair of the Western Hemisphere Subcommittee on the House Foreign Affairs Committee, is quite vocal in her belief that there ought to be elections in the fall of 2027. I agree with that. I understand Secretary Rubio and the Trump administration's caution about that, in that there are a series of things that would need to happen to allow that to happen. We'd have to have probably a new national electoral body. And if that's the case, now would be the time, this year would be the time for that to happen. If it's a question of updating the electoral rolls, all the people who could potentially vote, again, now would be the time for that. So all these things will take time. This calendar year would be the time to begin that process.
Now, there's another country that you are interested in, and we'll write on for
Yes,
the
I
Jerusalem
promise.
Strategic Tribune,
Yes.
is Cuba.
Yes.
Now, I understand the desire for regime change there on your part, as well as others.
From your lips to God's ears.
But I do wonder, how would this be executed? We have a history of tens of thousands of Cuban refugees washing up in Florida.
On our shores.
How do we avoid chaos?
So a couple of things. We have a very long history with Cuba, probably a 200-year history with Cuba, very complicated. The Cuban regime is very different than the Venezuelan regime. There have been some who've talked about we need to just find a Cuban version of Delcy Rodriguez, sort of the interim president who has appeared to be very cooperative and easy for us to work with. It's not clear that it's so simple for us to find such a Cuban Delcy Rodriguez. So you have to start with that. You're right. The Cubans have the option. There are very high percentages of Cubans who would like to leave Cuba. The Cuban government makes it difficult for people to leave Cuba. There is the absolute possibility they could make available rubber boats and rafts or materials to build rafts. You and I are old enough to remember the Mariel boat lift, which had about 100,000 Cubans showing up on Florida shores in 1980.
A lot of whom were, either
released from prison or other
drug dealers,
nothing
rapists.
Good. Nothing good. No bueno.
And caused havoc.
I believe Bill Clinton lost his 1982 election for governor in Arkansas.
That's correct.
One of the reasons was that he took on a large number of Cuban refugees into Arkansas, and many of the good folks of Arkansas did not like this, and he was punished for this in the 1982 election, and many people believe it was because of this. So having 100,000 or 200,000 or 300,000 Cubans showing up in Florida would be, say, right before the U.S. midterms, could be very destabilizing. So this is absolutely...
And Ron DeSantis, the governor of Florida, has warned explicitly against this scenario,
saying that he'll resist it, or he'll stop the boats from arriving, or this sort of thing. He'll use the National Guard or something to try and stop this. So he's right to be concerned. If I'm the Cuban regime, this is my nuclear option, because it's so politically destabilizing. And so I think this is a concern. The other concern, I think, is as we put pressure on the Cuban regime, there are many Cuban Americans in Florida who have family in Cuba. If those family members are suffering from the power outages or food shortages, and they ascribe blame to the Trump administration, you could see the same folks who are seeking pressure on Cuba to have second thoughts. So this is something to watch. So I hope that we can see significant change in Cuba. I hope that there doesn't come to a military action. I hope that the current Cuban regime does not seek to have a Mario boat lift 2.0. And I hope the pressure is powerful, but not so powerful that it hurts innocent people unduly.
Now, another country that you, the world traveler, have visited 8 times
Yes.
is Moldova. As it happens, I participated yesterday in a session at the Atlantic Council with a number of parliamentarians from Moldova. And one interesting facet that I was not aware of, and I'm eager to solicit your opinion, is that there is a movement to reunify with Romania.
Yes.
And I believe historically it was Moldova-Wallachia.
Correct.
Are you a proponent of this notion?
No, I am not in the short run. So Moldova is a country sandwiched between Ukraine and Romania. Moldova is primarily a Romanian-speaking country with a Russian-speaking minority. Moldova, think of it as sort of a, say 20% of greater Romania. So Romania, the history of Romania is Romania was contested by the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Ottomans, and the Russian Empire. And with the collapse of the Russian front in World War I and I believe the collapse of the Turkish, it created the space with the Treaty of Versailles to create, at the end of World War I, to create modern Romania. So between 1920, for this conversation, and 1940, Moldova.
Don't forget the Treaty of Trianon.
And the Treaty of Trianon.
1921.
1921.
Which is still resented in Hungary.
And still resented, very deeply resented in Hungary. So Romania was carved out of the carcass partially of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And so the Hungarians are sore about that. And so what I would say is that from 1921 to 1941, Moldova was part of Greater Romania. World War II happens, and at one point, Greater Romania was with Germany, Nazi Germany, and then at some point they switched sides. I can't remember when. So Moldova, as we know it, was either Bessarabia or Moldavia. But for your very sophisticated audience understanding, I'm going to say from 1820 to 1920 was part of the Russian Empire. So it was taken from the Ottomans. So for a period of several hundred years, it was part of the Ottoman Empire. It was a Romanian-speaking part of the Ottoman Empire, and then the Russians had it. Then it's briefly part of Greater Romania. And then with the collapse of the Soviet Union, so after World War II, Stalin took back this what had originally been part of the Russian, or what had previously been part of the Russian Empire, as what I would describe as a buffer state. But also I'm going to describe it perhaps as a punitive action by Stalin to punish Romania for having invaded the Soviet Union in partnership with the Nazi Germany. When I was in Moldova, and I also happened to be briefly in Odessa, and I took a tour, and the tour guide said to me, well, during World War II, we were occupied by Romania, which was interesting. And if you look at where Moldova is, where Chisinau, the capital of Moldova, is, the drive with no border and no holdup is less than 2.5 hours to Odessa. It's right around the corner.
Yeah.
It's hard to visualize. Even if you look at it on a map, it's hard to grasp.
It's much better than going from Warsaw.
Much. It's much closer than even on a map. So when the collapse of the Soviet Union happened, part of Moldova feared that many Moldovans would want to rejoin Romania. So there was a civil war within Moldova. The Russians backed the Russian-speaking minority in a part of the country called Transnistria, which still remains kind of like as a in quote-unquote country. Now, the Russians do not recognize Transnistria as a country. They recognize Moldova, including Transnistria, but it is a Russian-supported frozen conflict. It's more complicated than that. Okay. Of the 3.5 million or so Moldovans, at least 1 million have Romanian passports. So as opposed to Ukraine, where you can only have one passport, Moldova allows multiple passports. So 1 million citizens of Moldova have a Romanian passport. Now, I was shocked to President Maya Sandu, who is a very special leader of Moldova, who is a donor darling, very articulate, very charismatic, and is a donor darling, especially in Europe, came out after her second presidential election and the parliamentary election that she has a full absolute majority control, and said she is in favor of, if she could and there was a vote, she would vote in favor of such an action. So I found that surprising. I think part of her political base would like to see that happen, and part of her political base would not like to see this happen. The best solution would be for Moldova to be admitted into the European Union.
I knew that was coming.
Right, you know I'm going to go for that. And that is a more elegant solution and would allow for those folks who have fears about, quote unquote, joining Romania to sort of, everyone gets to have their cake and eat it too. There's like a very, very porous border with Romania. You fast track Moldova with reforms, but also over time, I believe, European Union accession for Moldova puts Moldova in a different category. And I believe if you have the right kind of government over the next 20 years, Moldova could be as wealthy as Estonia 20 years from now. It's a very poor country. But EU accession solves this Romania conundrum and helps be a carrot in dealing with this frozen conflict, but also creates a pathway for them to get rich.
Well, Dan, this has been a wildly illuminating session.
Thank you.
We've covered a huge amount of territory.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, Jacob. I'm always happy to be on.
Thank you.
Thank you.